Welcome to Global Stage, a podcast highlighting academic and policy-oriented international research on democracy and human development. Global Stage is a production of the Kellogg Institute for International Studies, part of the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame.
Welcome to Global Stage, a podcast of the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at the University of Notre Dame. My name is Patrick McQuestion. I'm a PhD student in political science here at Notre Dame, affiliated with the Kellogg Institute. This is a special edition of interviews conducted within the framework of the 2026 Global Democracy Conference organized by the Kellogg Institute. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Jhanisse Vaca Daza and Kevin Sheives. Jhanisse Vaca Daza is a human rights activist and co-founder of Ríos de Pie, representing Human Rights Foundation here as well at the conference. Her work focuses extensively on nonviolent resistance, civic mobilization, street-level sociology of power, particularly in countering populist strongman narratives. She was a featured panelist this week on the session, Why the People Love the Leader and What to Do About It. Kevin Sheives is the director at the International Forum for Democratic Studies at the National Endowment for Democracy. Kevin's research centers heavily on analytical trends of authoritarian influence, including geopolitical shifts and the evolving ways hostile regimes leverage digital tactics, including artificial intelligence, at the expense of global democratic practices. At this year's conference, he served as a panelist for the session, Testing the Limits, Authoritarian Influence at Scale in a New Period of Impunity. I'm really excited for this roundtable conversation where we'll discuss frontline civic activism as well as research on the international dimensions of authoritarian influence. Jhanisse, Kevin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, we're thrilled.
Thank you.
So this conference is on the global rise of authoritarianism. So today we want to focus as well on the counter strategies and different roadmaps for fighting back. There are no simple answers, of course, but your expertise on these topics, on mobilization, combating spoilers, can bring us closer to some sort of understanding. So on the topic of elections and combating spoilers, you focus on different levels of analysis. So I'd be really curious to hear how your approaches to combating authoritarianism meet. Kevin, you have an international sort of scale of analysis of authoritarian threats. Jhanisse, you focus as well on the local counter mobilizations towards authoritarian threats.
I think what's interesting about elections is that everybody in the world, for the most part, goes through them. Mm-hmm. And some are completely sham and not free and not fair. But even authoritarians go through the whole process of an election, even with their thumb on the scale, right? As a colleague of mine has looked at the issue of electoral authoritarianism and the drift in a place like Georgia, where you had all the trappings of a free society, and then suddenly a quick autocratic drift over the last 7 or 8 years. But it happened even in the midst of elections. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's good to just remind ourselves a little bit about the power of elections to be able to achieve democratic change, which is one of the reasons why I really want to talk to Jhanisse, and I'm so glad that you set this up, because the electoral dynamics and just generally the dynamics of Latin America are really fast moving right now. And there's, for every one sort of, or maybe for every 2 drift towards autocratization, there's really only one kind of drift towards democratization right now. And so Jhanisse wrote a really interesting article in Journal of Democracy not long ago about lessons learned for beating authoritarians at the polls in Bolivia. And I really wanted to hear a little more about that, because she was so clear on sort of like what are the lessons for democracy advocates, activists around the world, and how they think about this issue. So maybe I could tee you up to talk a little bit about that and what you thought were some really great lessons.
Thank you. No, and it's been something I mentioned in the essay was that doing the parallel vote count in Bolivia that we achieved last year was pretty much like building a plane while flying it, because when you are working in authoritarian countries or competitive authoritarian or electoral authoritarian, as whatever we want to call them, usually institutions are very weak. And that meant that in our case, not only were we facing elections in a moment of crisis, economic crisis, but also the electoral branch itself was very late to its own deadlines for the things that needed to be done. And it's been a wonderful, although painful experience to go through it, because it helped cement some ideas that I already had from strategic nonviolent struggle. And I really want to highlight here as an answer to the question, how do you counter authoritarianism? I think for a while, people were marveled with Gene Sharp's theory of nonviolent struggle. And this book was very famous and read by many activists. But we've kind of fallen in a trap of romanticizing and simplifying strategic nonviolent struggle instead of taking it as seriously as we should. It's essentially asymmetric warfare, even though we're not using violence. Activists are expected to learn the techniques to counter a whole authoritarian system that has international support from other countries in trainings that usually last 1 week or are done on Zoom over 4 hours. And that's not enough to teach someone how to strategize against such a huge opponent. And going back to the question about elections, there's a lot of principles that I gathered reading Gene Sharp, reading Bob Halby, reading Serja Popovic, Jamila Rakib, so many authors that write about this, Erika Chenoweth. There are 3 principles that I mentioned on the article, though I wish I could name many more, but the first one is the importance of having our own count. In Bolivia, we really made the effort to make sure that through AI, we had the possibility to process the numbers that we were getting from people on the streets so that we had our own numbers. Because a suspicion of fraud without the data that backs the real numbers is not enough for the international community to decide to support pro-democracy forces in a country when you have principles of supremacy and different international principles that wouldn't allow the international community to actually take a side. So the first one is have your own numbers, and I think that is very, very important. The second one was recruit at scale, and this is a mistake. Sorry if I'm taking too long, but this is a mistake that I've seen in so many countries, and it really bothers me, because when countries that are competitive authoritarian, where there is a chance to win perhaps for the opposition, but we still know that the authoritarian in power has more power than the opposition and they've skewed the game, most electoral observation processes for these are done only by experts that are electoral observators. And that's great. That's very important. It has its value. But when you limit the participation to only experts, most of them foreign, and let me tell you, foreign institutions charge a lot of money to do this type of electoral observation, you are stopping people from being participants of controlling something that is being made with their own funding, with their own money, and in their own country. So we recruited at scale. Our only line to be part of our movement was be above 18 years old because the law requires so, but you could be anywhere in the country, you could speak an indigenous language, you didn't need to speak Spanish. We made sure that everyone could participate because when everyone is part of electoral control, if they steal their vote, it's everyone's work that has been stolen. And I think that's very important to democratize electoral observation. And number 3, and we can talk about this more later, nonviolent discipline is so important. And I worry that in the context, and I mean, Kevin, you can speak about this a lot, given what's happening in Ukraine, given what's the different type of wars that we're going through, the legitimization of the use of violence is becoming more popular among pro-democracy movements. But violence is still statistically the least effective method for us to defend ourselves. So an adherence to nonviolent means is so important. And in our experience in Bolivia, I was very surprised because when we did Cuidemos el Voto and when we trained over 60,000 people to do the electoral control, when they came to the trainings, the part that they asked about the most and that they always wanted more information on was the nonviolence part. What to do if someone starts violence and your voting point? What to do if someone starts burning the ballot boxes? That's what people wanted to know. And it's an important part of the trainings, I think.
You mentioned Ukraine. You talk about those sort of total democratic resilience or total input of civil society, the fungibility of civil society. I was talking to one individual who's at the NED right now, and his story is about the total democratic resilience of Ukraine right now over the last 3 or 4 years. And the idea is that the high levels of civic activism in Ukraine that's been built over the last decade or two has been a huge boon for Ukraine and its defense against Russian aggression. Everything from e-governance specialists being the ones who are actually inventing and accelerating Ukraine's drone industry, which is now the envy of the entire world. You talked about how everyday citizens are doing things the way that Clara Barton would do in the American Revolution in the 1700s of bringing equipment and medical supplies to the front lines for Ukrainians, of human rights organizations who converted to war documentation efforts. Right. And so the idea is that when you have a lot of people involved, not just sort of the top level democracy and human rights activists, that it really kind of built a much bigger tent. And it sounds like that was a pretty big deal for how Bolivia was able to have quite the transition, and one in which that election felt more legitimate in terms of the outcome. I'm curious as well about what was interesting is that the Bolivia election was about, I guess, a year and a half after Venezuela's election, where the Venezuelan opposition did an absolutely phenomenal job under much more significant repressive conditions, and some of them even in exile, of being able to do that type of parallel vote tabulation using technology and things like that to prove that beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was Gonzalez that won, not Maduro. And, I know they're seeking still their democratic outcome. Tell me a little bit about was there any learning that you felt like happened from the Venezuela experience or from other elections around Latin America or the world that you felt like, you and your organizations were able to implement in Bolivia?
100%. And I think this is something that I love about this field, strategic nonviolence, because we get to learn from people and how they've done it before us, not only in our countries, but other countries. And obviously what happened in Venezuela was a huge source of inspiration. Something, though, that I was very clear, and this kind of points out to what you are an expert on, Kevin, is how people in my country are very, and I am too, if I'm fully honest with you, are very skeptical about foreign interference. So the first question that I would get was, are you using the same program that the Venezuelans use for the vote count? And we had to explain it's a very different voting system. We developed our own for Bolivia. But at the same time, the idea of organized civil society, a very quick parallel vote count that had results the election night. In our case, we had results 3 hours before the electoral branch. We may or may not have gotten calls from other institutions that were doing the vote count to check with ours. So we kind of became an informal reference point for many people and institutions. But so yes, indeed, we learned a lot from them. And even on a tactical point, I can speak for my movement, Standing Rivers. Even back in the 2019 elections in Bolivia, we were in touch with activists in Sudan who were having their own revolution, and activists in Hong Kong who were having the Hong Kong protests. And we were all exchanging tactics and points of view. And it was also very interesting, and I'm very happy to say this in a podcast that's going to be recorded. I remember very well that they used the same repression tactic in Sudan and in Bolivia on the same day. And we called each other and we were like, they are testing, they are using the same repression playbook in completely different continents. The tactic itself was in Sudan, they planted flags of a specific political party among the protesters that were doing a sit outside the military offices, if you remember. And that was to kind of divide people and have them to start fighting, because in theory, the protests were about all of Sudan, not one particular party. And in the case of Bolivia, they did this in Tarija, which is a city where I always think they test repression tactics in my country. And they planted LGBTQ flags among the protesters to start creating discussion on whether LGBTQ people were welcomed. But I found it very interesting that that was done on the same day. Maybe a coincidence? I don't think so. But yes, we have learned. And I think that's a small version that needs to be amplified of the cooperation among authoritarian regimes and how they share these repression tactics. Kevin, what have you found?
Yeah, no, this is something that I think is probably under-researched at this point, but you're starting to see some real anecdotal evidence of autocratic collaboration. Just to give you one example, in Iran over the last year, a lot of the ability of Iranians to access information during some of these protests and internet shutdowns was through Starlink and satellite. Right. And there's sort of reports now that have come out that some of the technology that the Iranian regime used to be able to block some of those satellite access, which is quite difficult, had come from either China or Russia. Article 19 is a really great organization that deals with free expression. There's an individual named Michael Castor who just wrote something for the International Forum for Democratic Studies Substack called Democracy's Horizons on the Beijing-Iran technology nexus and what it means for the rest of the world, right? He talks a lot about some of the different technological cooperation, not just hardware, but also the normative aspect and the legal aspect and how Iran developed its own legal structure and bureaucratic structure structure modeled after China's own surveillance system. And this is something that I think is a worry, not just for autocratic settings like Iran or Venezuela, where there's a bit more research on sort of the importation of China's model, but also others that take it piecemeal, whether that's a law here, a law there, or a hardware system there and a hardware system there. And I think that's something that democracies of all stripes need to be able to think about and consider. I want to ask you a follow-up a little bit on sort of the idea of mass mobilization and public anger and frustration over elites and the direction of their governance, which I think is obviously growing, right? There's people are on average satisfied with, or not satisfied with, but supportive of freedom, democracy, some of these general rights and principles, but they're really dissatisfied with their political elites, whether they're in advanced democracies, whether they're in struggling democracies. And I'm curious about the last year or two and what you think about the idea of how street protests, mass mobilization, public anger turns into real organized political action, whether that's through civil society or through political processes. I ask this because last year, the NED hosted a lecture with Leopoldo Lopez, who is one of the co-founders of the World Liberty Congress. And it's a really great lecture on technology and the use of freedom tech and the like. But he left us with a challenge, which was a really good one, about how we think about the freedom society and supporting freedom society out there. People who are more, in his term, on the front lines of trying to seek democratic change. And so this is, I think, an important question that I'd love your thoughts on, because so many of partly free democracies are going to where, it feels like almost like not a lost cause, but it's much more difficult, entrenched authoritarianism. And so how do you think about turning this public anger in places like Nepal, Sri Lanka, Kenya, Serbia, some other places that they aren't all that high on the democracy spectrum? How do they turn that into real organized political change? Do you have any thoughts on that?
100%. I do. And I'm going to go very nerdy with strategic nonviolence, but I think it's good to go back to this theory because people keep forgetting that it exists. And one thing and I saw this with my own eyes in my country, is that a problem when situations like this arise, where people are not happy with the situation in their countries, they're not happy with the results that democracy is bringing for them because the elites are not responding, is that they express this anger by repeating the same tactics. In the case of Bolivia, there was a study about the ways in which Bolivians protest from 2006 to 2016, I think. And the three tactics that we always repeated were roadblocks, street protests, and marches, people marching on the street, and vigils. And when you study strategic nonviolence theory, and I really recommend Gene Sharp, Bob Heldy, you realize that there are three methods of protest, like three big families. Persuasion tactics, which are when people get together in a place and they shout about something, they show that they are annoyed about something. And this is where usually most movements get stuck and they repeat this type of tactics. But you're never going to change a system or bring down a regime with persuasion tactics. They should be your gateway to recruiting people, to training them, to building a movement so that then you can move on to non-cooperation tactics. And non-cooperation tactics are civil disobedience, the ones that people know the most, but there are non-cooperation tactics that are economic, among this boycotts to specific companies. There are non-cooperation tactics that are social, which are the ones that my movement experiments the most with in Bolivia, because it's not illegal, but it also kind of throws people off and they don't know how to respond. So you can have great impact if you know how to plan it. And in theory, once you have recruited enough people, you've trained them well enough to do non-cooperation tactics, which are more high risk, then you can move to the third level, which is intervention tactics, which are most of them illegal, but in authoritarian countries, they shouldn't be. And they include things like taking over government buildings or hunger strikes or roadblocks, for example. And one tactic that is completely legal, but it is called intervention because it's high cost, but also high impact, is parallel institution building. And this is what I love. And I think this is the answer that I'm trying to get to your question.
Yeah.
When we do humanitarian work, we're essentially doing this because in Standing Rivers, we truly believe in the moral value of this. Gandhi talked about the service program, not only protesting, but also being of service to your community. But at the same time, you're filling a space that should be the government and that where they are not providing something to the public. So you're owning their legitimacy. And we've found that in moments of crisis, like the one that my country is going through today, people are so angry, but they also have no action to take this anger to, that when you give them a constructive thing to do, such as, help us bring food to this animal shelter, help us bring support to these people that are affected in a hospital. Even though they're angry, you can help release that anger into something that is constructive, and you build a network while doing that. And I know that Leopoldo and other people like Felix Madariaga, who's the current president of WOC, are experimenting with this. I really think this type of humanitarian work is also low risk in places that have high repression, because you don't necessarily have to say, I'm doing humanitarian work to take out the regime. You can simply do it for the sake of doing it. But I think that is a tactic and within a method that is very under observated.
It's interesting. It reminds me a little bit. I was about 2 years ago, the World Movement for Democracy had its annual assembly. And there I participated in a day-long workshop on how civil society can be able to deal and address foreign agent laws, which were coming out like every month or two. There was like one in Georgia, one previously, of course, from Russia, Kazakhstan. And it just was like a flood of these, which matter so much for being able to scale civil society efforts around the world. And it was a tabletop exercise, right? Everyone had their role. There was the democracy human rights activist. There was the intelligence services head. There was the president. There was the average citizen, right? Everyone had their kind of role. And we went through a day of kind of playing certain roles. And the thing that really changed the dynamic at a certain point, finally, away from the state and towards civic activists in these settings, was their ability to show real humanitarian, everyday value to your average citizen. Because the average citizen wasn't quite resonant with the idea of, those sort of loud human rights and democracy activists, like, well, I don't really care so much about them individually. We'll let them figure themselves out. But when they said, well, look, when we're providing this type of service, or you other civic activists who you don't think you're an activist, you're just a civic group doing, I don't know, everything from like food delivery and poverty relief and things like that, they're coming for you next. That's when the dynamic changed with the public. And there was much more public frustration with where the government was going, and it kind of cut the government on its back toes. And so those sort of similar type of lesson of being able to make sure that the democracy and human rights community on the ground is really showing that everyday humanitarian value, even if it is at the times and the lack of governance, it's sort of doing parallel institution building.
Yeah. And also to the point of what you mentioned on the panel today, people can feel so disempowered, and I am Bolivian. We had dictatorships in the 80s that were backed by the US, and then after that we went to having Russia, China, and Iran dictating our foreign policy. So as a Bolivian, you kind of look up and you realize that you are at the mercy of these foreign powers that keep fighting for you, but at the end, none of them is actually trying to benefit you fully. But in the process of Cuidemos el Voto, the whole idea was we have to save ourselves. And we weren't even asking people to trust. And this is a critique that I also have of our field, the pro-democracy field, where we sometimes pick one leader from one country and we make them the salvation of the country, and we centralize all the funding and all the support instead of sending that funding and support to parallel institutions within the country and the people doing the groundwork. But in our case, we were not telling people, trust Jhanisse or trust this person and we're going to count the votes for you. It was, you are going to count the votes. We're going to give you the app that's going to help you do it. But it's our country. So in the process of doing this type of work, it's important to empower the citizenry, especially when there's so much foreign intervention. We, as citizens, we need to feel empowered again, and like the future of the country is in our hands. Because it actually is. It's not even a lie. It truly is in our hands at the end of the day if we all organize and mobilize effectively. But that's been part of the Cuidemos el Voto experience. My heart aches because I think that sometimes in our field, we just focus on the one savior of the country and all the funding and the attention goes to them. But I think parallel institution building on the ground, that's where the international community should be spending their money.
At what point does that parallel institution start to improve governance? At what point does it start to be institutionalized? Or can you explain, I guess, sort of the benefits and the cost to doing this? I mean, is there an organizational capacity that's lost? Do people see this effort that they put into a system suddenly sort of fade away? Or is there sort of a built cumulative effect of coalition?
100%. And I think this also answers to another problem that is constant in our field, which is why do our transitions fail so much? And it's because we don't have parallel institutions that are ready to take over. So if you start building them and working on them ahead of time, as you're working on your nonviolent strategy, you're more likely to know who are the local leaders that have knowledge of the ground and that you can cooperate with in order to do this. And a clear example, there's a region in Bolivia called Chiquitania. It's the one that gets burned every year since the MAS passed those laws in 2019. And we worked very hard with the people in that region. I lived in that region as a child. For me, we're all the same family in a way. And when COVID came and the government had no resources to provide for everything that people needed, with the groups that live in the Chiquitania plus groups like Ríos de Pie, we built our own hospital. We built a whole hospital from the ground up, and then the government only had to give the items for 2 doctors to go and work there. But it was like, instead of us begging the central government to do their work, which they were not going to do, when people are organized and they know how to get things done, it's almost comical, because I feel like in my movement, half the year we wear firefighter suits, the rest of the year we look like doctors. Then we're also doing animal rescue. It's like, once you have the structure, people adapt and learn for survival.
And it flips the script on the idea of a very capable autocratic governance, right? When you can't do these basic services and you're having everyday people and civic groups doing that, it's kind of like, okay, all right, it's sort of like, The idea of transition moments brings me to one of the takeaways from the conference this week. Is one individual in his panel was talking about some pretty in-depth research that he did in Argentina about memory and memories of autocracy, right? And that one of the more effective narratives, or excuse me, one of the more effective ways in which individuals can maintain a strong commitment to democracy is remembering how bad autocracy was in certain places like Argentina or other places, Latin America, maybe Bolivia. Well, you talked about the dictatorships of the 80s and the earlier, and how that ended up being something that really pro-democracy groups can really hone in on and really try to perfect in a lot of places in order to preserve potential transitions. Because there are transition moments. You can never predict when they come. But at that point, that's an area where you can fund. That's an area where you can engage in as being able to really have strong elements of national memory over what autocracy at its worst form used to be. Because at a certain point, generations will change. Young people will be born who never lived under that, and suddenly they forget about, you name it, 1989 Tiananmen massacre or the Stasi of Eastern Europe. I mean, this is important for people to remember, and they can be powerful symbols. And I think that's a really practical thing that civic groups can do in times of transition to like prioritize what they focus on.
Totally agree.
What anything other that you kind of came out of this conference with that was a surprise?
So I'm not saying this because you're in the room. But in your panel just now, this kind of light bulb went up in my head on one of the last points that you mentioned about the vulnerabilities for democracies, because I'm watching this happen in my country right now. There's been a crisis in Bolivia. There are violent protesters. Some of them had legitimate asks, but it's escalated to the point where people are just asking for the president to resign. But what's really worrying is that in this protest that include roadblocks, they're not letting ambulances pass, and they're not letting 3 people have died in ambulances because they wouldn't let them pass. They're not letting firefighters get through, so people's lives are in danger. And we came out with a statement saying this is what international law says, like not letting an ambulance pass, it's a war crime. And people just don't care. Like once you are at that point, people don't care. And in your presentation, one of the last points was people are losing faith on the international system and international institutions. So the legitimacy of local leaders becomes even more important now. And I think that kind of sorry to go back to this point, but parallel institution building gives you very strong local leaders who are connected to the groundwork. So I think as weird as it sounds, one of the best ways to counter foreign intervention is by strengthening your local leadership. That's been beautiful for me to learn today. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, this has been a really wonderful roundtable. I really appreciate your insights. And I think this conference is a third of its kind. We're going to have hopefully a fourth one next year. It feels like there is a building of knowledge. It feels like the tone is a little different this year, in my opinion. It's been a little bit more pragmatic, I would say, more strategic and less anxiety prone or less foreboding. I think there was a lot of fear about what was going to come next, at least here in the United States with the election of Donald Trump. But this year feels a little bit more strategic. And I think that's a great call for strategic peace building, strategic nonviolent action. So any final insights or reflections?
I think the conference as well has been really fantastic. It's been great for me being in sort of someone in Washington to really hear from sort of the rich academic community on so many of those issues who are researching these things in depth on the pretty practical, pragmatic topic of electoral dynamics. And which is really, as I mentioned at the beginning, like the key. So many countries have these, and there's more opportunities, I think, than people give them credit for. Just because you have a non-free, not fair election doesn't mean you could dismiss the idea of elections being a means to sort of to democratize in the future and to sort of turn the tide.
Agree.
Well, thank you for tuning in to Global Stage. We hope that you like this episode, and please stay tuned for our next one. Thank you.
You've been listening to Global Stage, produced by the Kellogg Institute for International Studies. Listen to other episodes here or wherever you get your podcasts. Global Stage also can be found online at kellogg.nd.edu or by asking your smart speaker to play Global Stage.